Our last speaker of the program is Natalia Fabra from Universidad Carlos III de Madrid in Spain. She's a full professor there. Still, she will be a professor next week, but not the week after. She is moving to CEMFI, Center for Monetary and Financial Studies, still in Madrid, and you are moving your group there. So a bit about Natalia. I'm sure that many of you know Natalia. She's a public figure playing a prominent role in European electricity market designs. And she's doing a lot about the upcoming or ongoing European electricity market reform initiative by EU. Yeah, she's a full professor in Madrid. She is founder and director of Energy Ecolab. And she just got her second ERC, this time advanced ERC grant, called Energy in Transition. Before, Natalia had another ERC Consolidate grant. Natalia's main expertise, I would say, it's energy and environmental policies, and competition policy, actually, and energy economics. And I'm sure that many of you already studied or saw several papers of her, which are playing a key role in European electricity markets. Natalia, stage is yours. Thanks for coming, and
Thanks, Jalal, so much for the introduction, but especially for inviting me here. It's wonderful to see so many people around interested in these topics. You are all experts, so please take this as an attempt to share our most recent work on electricity market design with you. But I would encourage you to participate, interact, criticize, suggest on whatever I'm going to be discussing. After a 5-day summer school, I'm sure that you were experts before coming. You now even know much more than when you came. I know you have had great professors, among them Paul Josko, and as you're going to see, my work is highly influenced by his work. I consider Paul to be one of my mentors, and I'm being very glad to see that as time has passed by, we have been evolving with electricity markets. Our work has been evolving with the needs of electricity market design, and we've ended up, converging on still being interested by the same topics, yet from a very different, somehow, approach. So I've checked the material that he covered with you, and you are going to see that his session is a wonderful and amazing, policy introduction to many of the issues that I'm going to be covering here today, but I'll be doing that from more of an economic modeling type of perspective, okay? I'm not sure whether there are economists in the room, but bear with me. Our models are toy models as compared to the extremely complex models that you guys work with. So hopefully, they're going to be useful to provide insights as to how to understand the main challenges that, in my view, are facing electricity markets nowadays. Okay? In this audience, I don't need to stress that, I guess we're all here because we are concerned about climate change, and we are fully convinced that power markets have a key role to play in addressing climate change, not least because they can provide clean electricity, clean energy to decarbonize other sectors of the economy, such as transportation industry and so on and so forth, that find it more difficult to directly incorporate renewable energies into their production processes. So we first need to clean up the power sector and address the increasing electricity demand needs that are going to come with electrification in order to decarbonize the other sectors of the economy. So if the goal is to have carbon-free electricity markets by 2030, it's clear that significant, massive investments in renewable energies and fossil and storage technologies have to take place in order to be able to phase out fossil fuels almost fully. We know that electricity demand is rising to try to accommodate the increasing needs of other sectors of the economy. So massive expected increases in global electricity demand, and this is not just about data centers. So there is a lot of discussions in the public debate as to whether data centers are going to change the electricity landscape. Well, when it comes to the data, it seems that data centers are going to bring some additional electricity demand with some sensitivities, but this is not the game changer. The game changer is the increasing electricity needs, from many different sources, including electrification of transport, electrification of industry, electrification of the heating and air conditioning needs of the households, and so on and so forth. So we expect to see in the coming years, through different channels, an increase in electricity demand, which implies that we need to make massive investments in renewable energies to clean up the current electricity markets, but also to be able to address these increasing electricity needs. So whatever you look, this is these are scenarios from IRENA, but whatever sources you look for, you're going to see that truly, in order to comply with the 2035, 2040, 2050 goals, you name it, we need massive investments in renewable energies. And unfortunately, even though there's been quite a surge in renewable investments over the last few years, we are lagging behind. Okay, so for instance, in 2023, investments reach 0.9 trillion US dollars, yet we need almost 4 times that much in order not to lag behind. So not only we are lagging behind, but we also need to make even stronger efforts than what we have been doing so far. Clearly, technology is helping. So we have seen massive reductions in the investment cost of many renewable technologies. I'm sure you have seen this data or similar data very often. We have seen massive investment cost reductions in solar. The ones for wind have been more modest because it's more of a mature technology. We're also seeing massive investment cost reductions in storage. So clearly, the technological revolution that we have witnessed over the last few years is helping. The question that I want to share with you and also bring to the audience is whether this is enough. Is the technology necessary for sure condition to get this massive investment? Is it a sufficient condition? And my answer is going to be no. Technology helps, technology is necessary, but market design matters. Okay? Market design is shaping the incentives that investors have. Market design is shaping the investors that firms have in order to promote R&D, and therefore without the proper incentives, even though that potential technology could be out there to help us out, that technology revolution is not going to happen. Okay? So I'm an economist, I'm not an engineer, and I cannot talk about the technological revolution, but I can talk about how market design can help that technological revolution happen. Okay? I told you that Paul Josko is one of my mentors, so I could not start with a quote from someone different from Paul, and I think he was absolutely right when he raised this issue of, deploying renewables raises profound questions about market design. The issue is whether they can be adapted to provide good long-term price signals to support investments in an efficient portfolio of generating capacity and storage consistent with public policy goals. So as you see in these very brief quotes, there's already quite a lot, and you've been with him for 2 sessions, I guess. So you know exactly that all these words in this quote matter. We are talking about long-term price signals, so it's about supporting investment. We need to support investment in an efficient energy portfolio, so it's about a different set of technologies that need to be combined in order to be able to provide the public policy goals that we care about, which are those. Mainly, we want to decarbonize the power sector, so environmental goals, at the same time as we want to keep the lights on. That is security of supply. So we know that current markets broadly, they were designed for fossil fuel technologies that have very different attributes as compared to renewable energy technologies. We are going to discuss about this. I know that you already discussed about this already. And the shift from fossil fuel technologies to renewable energies, I think also calls for shifting the focus when it comes to market design, okay? So when our markets were mainly relying on fossil fuel technologies, an important objective was to achieve productive efficiency, that is, make sure that all the time we are using the least cost technologies to meet demand. But with renewables, essentially the marginal cost of production is zero, meaning from a short-run productive perspective, it doesn't really matter whether we are meeting demand with wind, offshore, onshore, solar. Once the investment has been made, essentially productive efficiency is not such a big issue. The big issue is to make sure that we are promoting investment efficiency, okay? In some cases, depending on the context, it is not as efficient to build wind as it is to build solar, or it is not as efficient to have a fully one technology system as to have a fully diversified system with technologies that can provide energy, in wintertime or in summertime or during the day or during the night with certain correlation, negative correlation with neighbors, and so on and so forth. So it's truly really about investment efficiency and not so much about productive efficiency. That it is not so much about making sure that in the short run the right plants are producing electricity to meet demand, but rather about making sure that we promote the right investments in the long run. So some of the focus is shifting from short-run markets to long-run markets, and this is why I wanted to devote my sessions today mostly to understand how those long-run contracts should be designed in order to contribute to the efficiency of the market, in order to make sure that our electricity market design is consistent with the public policy goals that we want to foster. Okay? This issue of whether it is short-run markets or long-run markets or a combination of both has come out very prominently in the debate in Europe regarding the electricity market reform. I guess many of you in the room are Europeans and probably you have been following the debate. For those of you who have not, just a very quick overview of what really happened. As you know, caused by the war in Ukraine, gas prices in Europe started to rise. This was immediately passed on to electricity market prices, whose prices truly skyrocket. And this triggered a debate led by the European Commission as to whether the market design was doing justice to consumers, as the President of the European Union put it, whether consumers are truly benefiting from the low cost of renewables, whether it is fair and efficient to have electricity market prices that are not decoupled from gas prices, and so on and so forth. So Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Union, called for a comprehensive market reform. That was in September, after the worst episode of gas price spikes. And by March, the European Commission had already produced a document on the electricity the new electricity market design that was passed by Parliament. So now we have this new directive on the electricity market reform that we can discuss. Also, offline, as an aside, I don't think it is such a breakthrough. I think it contains very relevant elements, but I don't think there's a before and after this reform. In any case, it contains important pieces, and it's certainly a common discussion as to how electricity markets should be designed in order to promote the energy transition. And this quote, I think, is probably the one that best summarizes the the building blocks of the reform that essentially advocates for complementing short-term markets with a greater role of long-term instruments. And why do we need long-term instruments? Because we want to allow consumers to benefit more from fixed-price contracts. And because we want these fixed-price contracts or these long-term instruments to facilitate investments in clean technologies. Why? Why is it that these long-term instruments facilitate investments in clean technologies? Because they provide secure and stable revenues for renewables and low-carbon energy developers by bringing down risk and capital cost, while at the same time avoiding willful profits in periods of high prices. Okay, so essentially, I think this is the main area of research, both research and policy discussions. How can we make truly benefit from the complementarity between short-run and long-run markets, and in particular, whereas much has been done and studied about electricity market design when it comes to short-term markets, there's much less on how to design these long-term instruments. So, as you know, short-run markets are extremely relevant. They still are very relevant. Why? Because they're absolutely necessary to promote efficient production and efficient consumption decisions. We know that productive efficiency requires that at all times, the lowest marginal cost power plants are the ones that meet demand. And we know that the cost of the available power plants change quite a lot, not only because the prices of the fossil fuel change over time, but also, and probably more importantly, because the availability of the almost zero marginal cost renewable resources also changes over time, and also demand changes over time. So we truly need this short-run price signal that provides information as to what is the marginal cost of producing electricity at every moment of time. And we need this short-run price signal not only to guide efficient demand decisions to the extent, and we were discussing this over coffee break, to the extent that demand is elastic and can respond to market prices, but also because flexible assets, including storage, truly needs this short-run price signal to know when they have to charge electricity and when they have to discharge electricity. And the role of these flexible storage technologies is absolutely necessary to make sure that we can meet demand at all times, that is, to guarantee security of supply. There's necessary conditions for the efficient performance of electricity markets, and for sure, short-run electricity market design also matters for the efficiency of these markets. First, we have to make sure that generators do not exercise market power. Firms with market power are able to offer their production at prices above marginal cost, withholding efficient production, and therefore not only increasing market prices above the marginal cost of producing the electricity, but also distorting the efficient dispatch. So if we want these short-run markets to provide an efficient short-run signal, we have to fight exercise of market power that comes mainly from the large energy providers. At the same time, we have to make sure that countries are able to trade electricity across them, so that the differences in the cost of producing electricity across the borders can be properly exploited, so that the high marginal cost country is able to import electricity from the low marginal cost country. This issue is particularly relevant, as you know, in Europe, where lack of interconnection capacity in some cases is preventing all these efficient trades from taking place. And if we want short-run markets to perform efficiently, we also need to expose some consumers, some market agents to the short-run price signal so that they can respond to it by shifting demand from high price periods to low price periods. This has been well studied. I know that you are all very familiar with this, but I wanted to bring it here because the fact that, as you will see, I'll be advocating for a greater role of long-run markets doesn't mean that I'm against short-run markets. Of course I'm not. They play an incredibly important role because when we are producing electricity, we need to invest. This is a long-run decision, and once the investment has been made, we need to produce, and this is a short-run decision. So we need these two instruments. Short-run markets are extremely relevant, and the fact that we are now shifting the focus to long-run markets does not mean by any means that we can do without short-run markets. Okay? From now onwards, I'll just be talking about long-run markets. Why? Because and we were discussing about this before as well, I believe that short-run markets are not enough. And I'm going to try to convince you why I think that having short-run markets alone is not enough, because it's not able to guide efficient investment decisions at least cost. Okay? So the content of the session is going to be as follows. By the way, you are not interrupting. Please feel free. Don't feel shy. Now we are going to really, truly enter into the deep content of the session. So if there's any questions, I think there's one up there.
Just one question regarding short-term markets. So you say that generators should not exercise market power, but what's the incentive then of changing from a two-price scheme to a one-price balancing scheme?
Sorry, can you repeat the last part of the question again?
So,
what is the incentive of?
Changing from a two-price balancing scheme to a one-price balancing scheme, because in the two-price, every generator.
What do you mean the two-price?
So there's a two-price imbalance scheme or a one-price scheme, and the two-price basically incentivizes generators to be as close to your forecast as possible, while the one-price does not do that and allows strategic bidding.
Yeah, absolutely. So the discussion as to whether we should have a single settlement and then solve the restrictions through through other markets, or whether everything should be embedded into the say day-ahead market clearing. I think it's a very important discussion that is also related to the possibility of exercising market power. I'm not going to be discussing this here. This would probably take us, at least 30, 40 minutes. And whereas I think those issues are relevant, I prefer to, shift the focus to long-run markets instead of discussing that. But we can talk about this during the break. Okay?
There's a question.
Just clarifying, do you make a distinction between marginal and incremental costs?
I'll be talking generally about marginal cost. I would, from an economic perspective, a marginal cost is an incremental cost.
It's the what?
A marginal cost is an incremental cost. Is the derivative of the cost function, right? So what happens to cost when I increase output?
So you would use those interchangeably?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. I guess you've been discussing about this. I'll be talking about marginal cost, which to me is an incremental cost.
Can I also ask a very quick question? So if we manage to have markets with high penetration of renewables, this cannibalization effect happens. Do we still need short-term market, or do you think in future, there will be only the need for long-term markets, no need for short-term markets? Do you think that scenario may happen?
I think we are going to still need short-run markets, because there's some assets that need the short-run price signal. Okay,
but
so
if the price
storage
is always
facilities.
Zero or close, but if the price happens to be always zero or close zero in short term, do you think that may happen if we have more and more renewables?
I mean, in theory, it could happen. I don't think it's going to happen, because if it was the case, probably here nobody's going to break even, right? And if we have renewables across the board, then what would be the need for having a storage? Price differences would go down to zero. A storage also would be cannibalized, because there would not be any sort of arbitrage profits. So eventually, if the investment cost of renewables become extremely low, maybe the optimal mix would be one in which we overinvest in renewable capacity to make sure that, at all times we have renewable energy, and therefore there's no need to trade or there's no need to have a storage. To be honest, I don't think we are going to be there because there's constraints to the scale of investments in renewables that we might have, including the fact that the territory is scarce, including the fact that some local communities oppose these renewables. So whether this might eventually happen, it's an important question, but I think there's many years still. Probably we won't be here to see those electricity markets in which prices are going to be zero across the board. And in the meantime, we have to make sure that we get there. That is that we manage to provide to society electricity that is secure, that is affordable, and that is sustainable. So I still analyze electricity markets as markets in which we need this short-run price signal to guide this production and consumption and storage decisions. Okay, so I'll be talking about long-term instruments with the underlying short-term markets operating on a daily basis. Okay. So the plan for today's talk is going to be as follows. First, I'm going to try to argue why we need these long-term instruments and why these long-term instruments become the more important in renewable-dominated systems. And then I'm going to jump into our economic models. You will see these are very simple models, but hopefully models that are able to shed light on important questions, such as if we all agree that, or there seems to be quite a consensus on the need of long-term markets, why is it that the markets are failing in providing enough liquidity of these long-term contracts? So I'm going to develop a model of long-term contracting, characterizing what we economists refer to the first best. That is what we would get if we had a fully informed social planner. What would this social planner would like to do? And this is going to serve as a benchmark to compare the market outcome. I'm going to be adding counterparty risk. I'm going to be more specific about what I mean by counterparty risk, which we think it's an important element, which is probably underlying the lack of liquidity of these markets. Because markets for long-term instruments fail, okay, we are seeing that in reality, and we are going to see that this also comes out of the model. Then there's been public policies aimed at promoting long-term contracting, and we are going to go through these public policies that have been put forward, and through the lenses of the model, we are going to analyze the properties of these public policies to be able to compare them and assess which of them works better and when. And for that purpose, I'm also going to be showing you the results of some simulations, simple simulations as to the effects of these public policies. One of these public policies is truly having the regulator come up and say, if the market is not providing these long-term instruments, I'm going to become the counterparty of these contracts. These are, as you know, the contract for differences that are auctioned off by regulators. And this opens the door of, many interesting questions regarding contract design, okay? So if we as regulators or we as public entities, we are going to auction off these contracts, how do we want to auction them off? What is the auction format that we want to use? What are the characteristics of these contracts? Do we want to make them really long-term or less so? Do we want to include some price exposure? Yes or no? Why? Do we want to have auctions in which all sorts of renewable technologies compete? Or do we want to have more kind of technology-specific auctions? What are the consequences? And so on and so forth. That is, when we become the counterparty of these contracts, we have much more leeway to design those contracts as opposed to private PPAs, that is, private bilateral contracts, in which, in essence, is the contracting parties, buyers and sellers, who on their own decide on the characteristics of these contracts to satisfy their needs, but these needs need not be aligned with the system-wide needs. Okay? And then I'm going to conclude. Good? Any doubts, questions, comments? Excellent. So let me go for some reasons for why I believe that we need long-term contracts for deploying renewable energies. And you're going to see here that I'm also very aligned with what Paul just described. The first stylized facts that we are all very aware of is that renewable energy investments are highly capital intensive, and once the investment is made, the marginal cost of producing electricity out of these plants is almost zero. So here you have an stylized cost breakup of the cost of power generation technologies. We know that not only renewable energies are more competitive relative to the fossil fuel technologies already, but rather than focusing on that, I want to focus on their cost structure. When it comes to renewable technologies, 100% of the total cost are fixed costs. That is, once the investment is made, there is very little margin to try to reduce the cost because all the costs are sunk at the investment stage. Whereas when it comes to gas and coal, the weight of fixed cost is much lower. The main cost is the variable cost of having to buy the gas and the coal that we are going to burn to produce electricity, as well as the CO2 permits in order to be able to cover the emissions of those technologies. This variable cost component is highly volatile, as we have seen certainly in Europe over the last years. So here you have a time series showing the electricity prices in Iberia, Spain, and Portugal. And except for the periods during the energy crisis when there was a market intervention, so some of you might be familiar with that, Spain and Portugal implemented the so-called Iberian solution by which they would subsidize gas-fired generation in order to avoid that gas producers would pass on the true cost of gas to electricity prices, and this was effective in trying to avoid the price spikes that were seen in other European countries. So excluding this period of the market intervention, of course we have seen, and this is Spanish data, but the same applies to any other member states, that electricity prices are highly correlated with the marginal cost of producing electricity in gas-fired power plants, because gas-fired power plants are the price-setting technology. Okay? So electricity market prices are highly volatile, reflecting the volatility in gas prices, and clearly these prices are unrelated to the average cost of renewable energies. So when we are exposing renewable energies to the short-run market prices, we are exposing them to highly volatile profit margins, because their costs are zero, their average costs are flat, and therefore the difference between the short-run market price and their own cost is highly volatile. Fossil fuels, they are also exposed to short-term market prices, which are volatile, but that volatility is reflecting the volatility in their own costs, so their profit margin is quite stable. They have a natural hedge that renewables don't have. Not only electricity market prices reflect the volatile price of gas, but increasingly it is the case as we deploy more renewable technologies that the cannibalization effect occurs. Why? Because at times when there is a lot of renewable production, so again, this is data from Spain, a representative day during the summer, when we have a lot of solar, clearly prices fall down to zero, reflecting the zero marginal cost of renewable energies, so that there's volatility, not also because prices when gas-fired power plants are setting the market price are highly volatile, but also because there's increasing uncertainty over the incidence of these very low price periods. So there's a double source of price uncertainty that is particularly damaging for the revenues that renewable energies can make if we only expose them to short-run market prices. This is compounded by the fact that clearly, we are dealing with assets that are extremely long-lived. So renewables can live for 25 years and above. So all this uncertainty is compounded year after year. So once I have to take my investment decision, I am facing all the uncertainty regarding future electricity market prices over a long period of time, without really having any flexibility to adjust my costs, because all those costs are sunk from day one. And this is coupled with the fact, I didn't bring evidence about this, that there's missing markets, there's missing financial markets. So many of these uncertainties cannot be hedged. I cannot, if I am an investor, I want to invest, I want to hedge against all this risk. There's no financial markets out there to allow me to hedge for those risks. So why is this relevant? This is relevant because if I am investing in a highly risky asset, when I go to the bank to get money to finance my investment, the bank is going to say, no, I'm not willing to lend you money because your project is so risky. Or if I lend you money, the cost of capital that you're going to face is very high. And this is making it increasingly challenging for the investors to carry out the investments, to the extent that this uncertainty is adding risk premium to the cost of capital and is limiting access to capital, and all this together is limiting the scale of the investments. Okay? Clearly, I'm talking about renewables. I could be talking about the storage. I could also be talking about nuclear power plants for those countries who want to invest in nuclear that face similar problems in that respect. I could also be talking about other infrastructures that also have heavy capital costs and are also long-lived. I'm not claiming that these issues are unique to renewable energies, but I'm saying that clearly in this context, these issues become particularly relevant, not least because of the scale of the investments that we need to carry out. Okay? So given that it's truly about risks that have nothing to do with the efficiency of the, so here there's not a risk efficiency kind of trade-off as we can see in other sectors of activity. Here is truly a risk that is not providing an incentive effect. We want to reduce risk, and how do we reduce risk? By providing these long-term instruments that reduce the uncertainty faced by investors and therefore help support renewable energy investments by facilitating access to cheaper capital. Okay? There's very little evidence on truly, how do these different contracting arrangements affect the cost of the investments. I collaborate with people from the Bank of Spain who have access to all the set of loans that are given in the country, and we have been trying to dig into this question. And even with access data, it's extremely complex exercise to do because there's parent companies, there's project finance. The parent company might be getting the funding, for the power plants. Many of these companies are extremely large companies, so they ask for loans, not only to finance these investments, but also other sort of expenses. So, it's extremely difficult to get sound evidence that allows to back this claim that, with longer-term instruments, we managed to reduce the cost of funding. And the only paper that I know, and it's only a survey paper, provides some suggestive evidence in this respect. So this is a paper that using responses to a survey is able to provide some suggestive evidence that when these projects receive or have or are backed by either a PPA or a regulator-backed CFD, they manage to increase the gearing ratio and reduce the cost of capital, particularly when it comes to PPAs, when the counterparty is an investment-grade counterparty, also putting the emphasis on the importance of the counterparty. Yes?
What's gearing ratio, sorry?
How much, what is the ratio between your debt and your equity, okay? So to what extent your project is truly financed through outside debt. And the higher this ratio is, the higher the internal rate of return of the project, okay? But this is the only evidence I am aware of, and it would be great if people could come up and provide higher quality evidence linking the type of long-term instruments that the investors have and the cost of capital. Okay. So, if the solution or part of the solution is let's have more long-term contracts, the question is, why is it that we don't have long-term contracts, okay? So if long-term contracts are good for sellers because they allow them to get more capital at lower cost, and if it's good for buyers because also buyers manage to reduce their price exposure, why is it that markets are not delivering these contracts spontaneously? Why is it that there's insufficient liquidity? Why is it that these markets for long-term contracts are failing to the point that governments need to intervene to provide this contract liquidity? I think these questions are absolutely key, and my sense is that they have not been fully addressed, and this is why, together with my co-author Gerard Llobet, we started this research agenda trying to understand better why these markets are failing and what we can do about this. Okay? In the document of the electricity market reform of the European Commission, they don't discuss much about this. They say we need to have more of them, but they don't answer the question as to why is it that we don't have more of them, right? They only point at one potential reason in one of the paragraphs of the report that reads as follows. We don't have enough of these contracts because the buyers are typically limited to large companies, okay? So it's true that, when and you check this evidence with Paul Josko, when it comes to PPAs, mainly it's corporate PPAs where the counterparty is, Google, Amazon, Walmart, or extremely large companies. We have limited participation from smaller buyers. Why? Because it's particularly difficult to cover the risk of payment default from the buyer in these long-term agreements. Okay, so it seems that only the large companies that have high credit ratings are able to enter into these long-term contracts, but this is a very limited set of all the buyers that we have in the economy, and this limited participation from the buyer side is constraining the amount of contracts or the contract liquidity that we might have in this market. So why is it that there is a risk of payment default from buyers? Why is it that the sellers fear that eventually down the road, during the duration of the contracts, buyers might eventually walk out of the contract, okay? Is it that buyers are bad, they act opportunistically, or is it because, they need to act that way out of necessity? Okay, so let's again look at the evolution of electricity market prices in Europe. The black line, as you know, these markets, there's very little information about the markets for PPAs because these are private bilateral contracts, and there's only essentially indexes provided by companies such as Pexapark. We have a lot of information about short-run markets. We can even see, all the steps of the bid function submitted by plants on an hourly basis, and even more than that. So we have extremely, a lot of transparency regarding short-term markets, but we know very little about long-term contract markets. And this very little piece of evidence that we have, I have plotted here. So this is an index of the PPA prices in Europe. As you can see, somehow they correlate with the spot market prices. And when the spot market prices in Europe peaked, so did the prices of PPAs. Suppose that you are a buyer and you decide to sign one of these PPAs at a fixed price at the peak of the crisis, okay? So you are paying electricity, say, at 180 euros, and then you start seeing that spot market prices go down. Suppose that you're an energy retailer. If you pass on the price of your contract to the final buyer, 180 euro, you're going to be out of the market very quickly. Why? Because your competitors in the downstream markets, they're able to access electricity at a much shorter, at a much lower price, and therefore you're not going to be competitive vis-a-vis your competitors, okay? So you have to walk out of the contract, not because you're opportunistic and you prefer to buy at the cheaper spot market price, simply because you are out of the market, okay? Yes?
Could you please elaborate how this PPA price has been calculated?
I cannot, because this is data from Pexapark that provides this price index that is based on survey responses So they construct this index, and this is at least me. If you guys have additional sources of
So it's the
information.
weighted average price of a certain
Probably it's
amount
a
of
weighted
PPAs.
average, yeah, of the reported contracts at each moment of time. But we don't know, probably here they're mixing contracts of different duration, different
And
characteristics,
it's in a
different
certain
countries.
country, or?
I think this is a European-wide index, but this is just for illustration purposes. Just to say, if you enter into a long-term contract, you can be stuck with a price which is much higher than the prices at which your competitors can buy electricity. And this applies to energy retailers, but this also applies to manufacturing companies producing aluminium, for instance. If you pass on the cost of a fixed price contract to the price of aluminium that you sell, you're going to lose competitiveness in the market, and therefore you're also going to be out of the market. And this type of trend, this occur because of the crisis, but even without the crisis, in the future we expect to see much lower short-term prices. So the trend is that in the future, spot market prices are going to keep on going down and down and down, therefore making fixed price contracts that were signed previously truly not attractive. The fear that this might happen in the future is preventing sellers from entering into a fixed price contract, because they know that if they enter into a fixed price contract, eventually the buyer is going to walk out of the contract, and it's also preventing buyers from entering into these contracts, because very often these contracts, they are backed by a collateral, or if you walk out of the contract, you are facing a penalty, and therefore to the extent that eventually I might want to walk out of the contract, I don't want to be faced with this penalty or loss of collateral. Okay, so it seems that truly, the risk of covering the probability of default from the buyer is stopping both sides from entering into these long-term contracts. So we wanted to take counterparty risk to the core of the model, to try to understand whether counterparty risk could be one of the reasons behind the lack of the poor contract liquidity of these long-term contracts, and therefore try to understand what can be done about this. Okay? Any questions?
So you were arguing that in the future, short-term prices would go down. So what would be the incentive for anyone to sign a long-term PPA if they foresee lower prices in the short term and they have flexibility to avoid peak hours or so?
Absolutely. So this is going to be critical, and this is going to come up in the model, in a very simple model. Sellers are not going to be willing to enter into the contracts whose price is above the expected spot market price. Okay, so there's going to be a participation constraint for the buyers. Okay, but the sellers, they also have a participation constraint, right? They don't want to sell contracts at prices below what they expect to get if they trade it in the spot market alone. But because of risk aversion, you're going to see that in the model, there's a wedge between, or there could be a wedge between the maximum price that buyers are willing to pay and the minimum price that buyers are willing to receive. And this is truly what is opening up the possibility of trade between these two parties. But you're going to see that this is going to be central to the analysis, and some of this is going to be explaining the lack of liquidity of some of these contracts if the price that sellers are willing to pay are below the minimum prices that sellers are willing to receive. Okay, so bear with me, and this will come up in a second. Okay. Any additional questions?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask, what do you think about mechanisms like capacity mechanism from entities who can, like TSOs, who can carry enough risks since they are natural monopolies, and how can it help to provide incentive for such a long-term contract?
Key question. This is going to be the focus of probably the second part of the session. So I'm asking you also to bear with me, and I'll probably come back with that question, because that's going to be the focus. Okay. Good. So let me jump into the model. Again, forgive me for being so simple in many respects. You engineers, you know the nitty-gritty details of the markets. Our job as economists, and I insist a lot with my PhD students, is to try to make the models as simple as possible, okay? Because it's out of the simplicity that we can try to get the insights. It's not that I'm forgetting about all the complexities out there. It's just I'm trying to simplify them to be able to uncover the main building blocks and the main insights, okay? And please interrupt me whenever you want. So I'm going to be considering a market for a homogeneous product. Here we are talking about electricity, a fully homogeneous product, the most homogeneous product that we can think of. In this market, there's a unit mass of identical buyers, and each of them, they demand 1 unit of electricity, which they value at V. Okay, so you can think of V, for instance, of the value of load. Okay. Demands, electricity demands by these buyers can be served either by existing capacity or by new capacity. Okay? To make things simple, you can think of existing capacity as being gas-fired generation capacity that has some marginal cost, which are volatile. Why are marginal cost of gas-fired generation capacity volatile? Because gas prices in international markets are volatile. So I'm going to use P to denote the marginal cost of gas-fired generation, which is distributed according to some cumulative distribution function with a positive density and an expected value equal to expected P. Okay? This is existing capacity. Instead of relying on existing capacity, we can also meet some of our demand needs with new capacity. So think of this new capacity as being renewable energy capacity. It can be provided by a unit mass of sellers, okay, who can build 1 unit of renewable capacity, and they have heterogeneous investment costs. So we have different potential investors who need to invest or who are considering whether to invest in a renewable power plant. If they do so, they have to incur a fixed cost C, and these fixed costs, they are also heterogeneous, and they're also distributed according to some cumulative distribution function in the unit interval. But once this investment is being made, they're able to produce, each of them, 1 unit of production at a marginal cost equal to 0. Okay? So here we are missing many relevant aspects of reality. For instance, let me mention one. Here I'm not allowing renewables, or I'm not incorporating the fact that renewables are intermittent. I'm simply assuming that if you invest 1 unit of capacity, you get at base load 1 unit of output. This is clearly not the case. We wish that was the case. It is not the case, but it allows me to simplify the problem and highlight some of the main factors that are at play. Okay, so this is my simple game, my buyers, my sellers, my potential entrants with heterogeneous cost. How does this game evolve over time? So we have a first stage in which the potential entrants, they observe their investment cost, and they decide whether they want to invest or not. Once they make this investment decision, they don't know at which prices the spot market is going to trade, because these gas prices are realized only after the investments are being made. And once this marginal cost is being realized, then we can have short-term trading that takes place in a spot market, which I assume to be perfectly competitive. Okay, so I'm assuming away market power concerns, because the market is perfectly competitive. The spot market price is going to reflect the marginal cost of the existing capacity, gas-fired generation. Okay, so if the investors invest in this market, so far without long-term instruments, they expect to be receiving a spot market price equal to expected P. A very important element of the model is that I'm assuming that sellers are risk averse. Okay? What does it mean that sellers are risk averse? It means that they dislike price volatility. Not only they care about the expected price, they care about the expected price, but price volatility introduces some disutility, which in this model I'm going to capture with a risk premium R. Okay? So if I expect to receive a price equal to expected P, because I am risk averse, I also have to pay an extra cost equal to R. You can also think of this as, the additional risk premium that the bank is asking the investor whenever the investor is faced with a spot market price volatility. So not only they have to pay, say, the hardcore investment cost, but on top of that, they have to pay the additional interest rates to the bank because they're fully exposed to a spot market price volatility. So this is the expected profit of an entrant. This is the expected profit of a buyer. So, they go to the market, they consume 1 unit of electricity, and for that unit, they expect to pay expected P. Okay? So extremely, extremely simple. What is the value of this additional capacity? Would a social planner like to invest in this additional capacity? Well, there's a trade-off because the additional capacity implies that there's an investment cost C. But the additional capacity also allows to save on production cost because instead of having to burn gas that costs P, this new plant is going to be able to produce electricity at a marginal cost equal to 0, and therefore there's an expected cost saving equal to expected P. It's the expected saving in the cost of gas-fired generation relative to the 0 marginal cost of the plant. So if we could decide how much capacity we would like to have, then the social planner would say, I'm going to invest in renewable capacity up to the point at which the investment cost of the marginal investor is just equal to the expected savings in productive cost. And this is going to be the optimal investment. Of course, I'm also forgetting about all the positive externalities created by renewable energies. Okay? If I throw into the model these positive externalities, not only would I get savings in productive cost, I would also get additional benefits through other externalities that would be included here and therefore would give rise to more investment. I would like to promote investor even by higher cost investors. But because externalities are a market failure, we know it is there. I want to show that even on top of those market failures, there's an additional one, which is the one that I want to highlight. Does the market provide this optimal investment? And the answer is no. Why? Because the sellers, when they are fully exposed to spot market prices, they don't receive the expected price only. They receive the expected price, but because they have this higher cost R, they're going to reduce the scale of the investment. We are only going to have investment up to the point at which the marginal investor has an investment cost equal to expected P minus R. Okay, so this extremely simple, observation allows us to conclude that the market is underinvesting, because exposure to spot market prices is creating an additional cost, which is reducing the scale of investments. If it's about risk, then why not consider long-term contracts? And you know this very well. So what do I mean by a long-term contract? I simply mean that sellers and buyers, they keep on trading in the spot market, but on the side, they sign these. We can easily, without loss of generality, focus on financial contracts. They can sign these PPAs if the counterparty is a private buyer, or they can sign contract for differences if the counterparty is a public entity that allows them to hedge the price volatility inherent in spot market trading. Sellers are able to reduce their risk profile, and they can use this contract as collateral when they go to the bank and ask for money. And as for the sellers, well, and as for the buyers, by entering into one of these fixed price contracts, they can also reduce their price exposure. And these contracts often allow them to secure and be able to document that they are buying green sources of energy, which in some cases, depending on the regulation and depending on the governance, is useful to comply with regulatory and CSR purposes. Okay, so let's try to include these long-term contracts in our simple model, and let's start doing this by assuming that the counterparty always honors the contract. So there's no counterparty risk for now. Later on, we are going to add counterparty risk to see what counterparty risk does to the solution of the problem. Okay. So when we add these contracts, in essence, we are adding an additional stage to the game. So before the investment is made, buyers and sellers, they meet to agree on a long-term contract, which is perfectly enforceable. And in essence, in this simple model, they simply have to agree on the fixed price at which they're going to be trading electricity. And I'm going to be using F to denote the fixed price of the contract. To capture the fact that there's limited participation in these markets from the buyer side, as the European Commission's quote highlighted, I'm going to parameterize this limited participation with a parameter theta. Theta is a parameter between 0 and 1. Remember that the mass of buyers is equal to 1. So theta denotes the share of buyers that are willing to sign a fixed price contract. Okay? So in the paper, we endogenize this theta. In the presentation, for now, for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to take this as an exogenous parameter. How do we endogenize theta? Well, we assume we have an extension of the model in which we say if buyers want to enter into a fixed price contract, they have to provide collateral. Collateral is costly, okay? And therefore, not all the buyers are able to put up this collateral, and this introduces some sort of demand elasticity from the buyer's side that somehow captures or the fact that there's limited participation. But for now, take this to be an exogenous parameter that allows to parameterize whether there's limited or participation from the buyer side. Okay? Because sellers have a perfectly enforceable fixed price contract, they are no longer exposed to spot market price volatility. So when they go to the bank says, oh, this is wonderful. You have a fixed price contract, no price volatility. I'm willing to give you the loan without this additional cost that we capture with the parameter R. Okay? So for sellers, it's good. Now they know that they're going to sell their unit of electricity at the fixed price contract, and they're only going to have to invest to incur in the investment cost without facing their risk premium. And the buyers, they get their electricity, they get V times their consumption equal to 1 minus the fixed price of the contract. Okay? So do they want to enter into this contract? Do they want to participate or not? And here it comes the answer to your question. So we know that buyers, they can instead of signing the fixed price contract, they can always go to the spot market and buy the electricity at the expected spot market price. So if the contract price, so in the axis here we have quantity of contracts and the price of contracts. So if the price of contracts happens to be above the expected spot market price, they say, no, thank you. I don't want to sign this contract. I would rather go and buy electricity in the spot market directly. But if the contract price is below the expected spot market price, all of them are going to demand the contracts that are on sale. Okay, so this is the demand function, very, very simple. And what about the supply side? So sellers, they have two types of constraints they have to satisfy. On the one hand, the price F has to allow them to break even. Okay, so their cost is equal to C, so F has to be above C. Because C, the investment cost, is heterogeneous, then we have that here, on this linear part of the supply function, we have that as we increase F, The binding constraint is this break-even constraint. So as we increase F, there's more and more sellers who find it profitable to enter into the contract market, because this contract price F allows them exactly to cover their investment cost C. But what about the low-cost sellers? The low-cost sellers, they could break even if they enter into the spot market. Why? Because their investment costs are below the expected spot market price and the risk premium they have to pay to the bank if they go completely unhedged. Okay? So for these sellers, for these low-cost sellers, the binding constraint is the outside option. That is, I'm going to invest anyway, but through the contract, you have to give me a sufficiently high price so that I find it more attractive to go into the contract and not into the spot market. Okay? So this is the binding constraint for these sellers, and altogether, this conforms the supply function of contracts. Okay? Very simple supply function. If we have enough participation so that we get more demand for contracts above the amount of contracts that we would get without contracts, remember that without contracts, we would have that the marginal investor would have an investment cost equal to the expected spot market price minus the risk premium, okay? So this is the amount of investment that we get without contracts. If we have contract demand above that level, the market clearing solution is going to be at a contract price such that the market clears and demand is equal to the supply of contracts. Okay? So if we allow for this amount of contracts, if we encourage enough participation, we're going to get more investment than without contracts. Okay? But we're going to get less investment than in the first best. Remember that the social planner wanted to have investment up to the point at which the marginal investor had an investment cost equal to the expected spot market price. So in this very simple economy, how can we get closer to the social planner optimal amount of investment? Well, simply by promoting contract demand. So if we promote contract demand, okay, whatever that means, and we are going to look into the public policies, then we are going to allow for an increase in the contract price that is going to open up the market to higher cost investors that would not be able to invest otherwise, and therefore we are getting closer and closer to the first best capacity. Okay? If we ended up here, okay, the solution would be, if you want to have more renewable investments that are efficient, then, let's just promote participation in the long-term contract market. Let's not just have Google's, Amazon's, and Walmart enter into this contract. Let's promote contract participation, and this is going to give us the scale, the enough contract liquidity so that we achieve the optimal scale of these investments. Okay? The question is this still the case? Is this still true if we allow counterparty risk? Okay? So in the model, what we do is we throw in counterparty risk to see whether it is still the case that by promoting contract demand, we get closer to the first best, or whether something else has to be done in order to promote the efficient amount of investments. Okay? We have extra 5 minutes. I understand that we have to finish at more or less. Let me introduce counterparty risk, okay, before the break. So how do we introduce, by the way, are there any questions? This is a very simple version of the model, so I want to make sure that everybody is on the same page.
Maybe you're going to cover it in later. Like, how do you then promote high contract demand? Are you going to cover this, or?
I'm going to discuss this, but we can already discuss this. So, for instance, this could be through contract standardization. So we think that one of the obstacles for buyers signing these long-term contracts is because lawyers are super costly, and signing one of these PPAs requires a lot of complexity. Let's make these contracts more standard. We could also do it by making these contracts compulsory. So, have an obligation on the load-serving entities and say, 50% of your load has to be covered by one of these long-term contracts. So it could be done in different ways. So you can think of renewable portfolio standards, would be a way to promote long-term contracting in these markets. This is one way of doing it. I'm not saying I'm in favor of this. So let me postpone the answer as to whether this is the right thing to do or not to when we discuss the public policies through the lights of this model. Okay?
Thanks. Sorry. Yeah, I understand so far that the contract quantity is based on the expected fuel cost and risk premium, and then you sort of determine the point in the middle. I'm curious, how would you consider, I guess, unit commitment costs and the fact that fossil fuel generators will be turned on and off more frequently in the future? And how would that change how we should think about the optimal quantity for contracts?
Yeah, this is completely out of the model. Not only that, if you I think it lost battery or something.
No, you need to be close to the computer.
Okay. So this model is extremely simple, not only because it doesn't take into account the increased cost of the fossil fuels if they have to turn on and off more frequently. One could even wonder whether this would affect the investment decisions of these assets, or they would affect the price at which they're offered their output in the spot market, in which case it would not affect the equilibrium in the spot market. This is not there. Not only that is not there, if you note, when I show you the simple merit order in this market, I assume that the market price in this market is constant at P, regardless of the amount of investment in renewables that we have. Typically, one would expect that as we invest more in renewables, the marginal cost of the price-setting gas-fired plant is lower because typically the supply function is upward sloping. And I'm not even considering that. I'm assuming that the spot market price is constant at P, regardless of how much investment there is. So what you are saying would be, the second derivative of this very simple assumption. Again, my model is super simple. If I started adding this or unit commitment or increasing costs as we ask them to be more flexible and all that, the model would become more complex, and the insights that I want to get about contract liquidity would probably be still there. I don't see any reason for why this would, affect the type of conclusions that I'm going to get regarding long-term contracts. Any additional questions? Okay, so you know what? Good, please.
How does this differ from today?
What do you mean?
Well, I
This
mean,
is
we have
reflecting to
people,
this.
and generators go to the banks for financing. They've signed PPAs with Walmart and Google and Amazon. And is it just they're not getting to the equilibrium, or?
Well, I'm describing, this is a stylized representation of today. That is a situation in which if there's no enough participation of buyers in the long-term contract market, we get an investment, we get contract liquidity which is below the first best. So if Walmart, Google, and everything is just low theta, or theta here, I don't know exactly what this is just a representation. It's telling me that the amount of contracts and therefore the amount of investments that we get is below what we would like to get. Without contracts, so only relying on the spot market, we get even less. So the fact that there's some buyers willing to enter into these contracts is improving the market performance beyond what we get with only a spot market trading, okay? Why? Because these contracts allow to reduce the investment cost. But if there's little participation, we are far from getting the optimal. So this is a description, believe it or not, this is a description of the way markets works as we now know them. I don't know whether Paul Josko discussed this, but the liquidity of PPAs is very little as compared to the scale of the investments that we need. There's not enough of these contracts. So according to this model so far, the reason why we don't have enough of these contracts is because there's limited participation. This is what the model so far is telling us, okay? So if this is the reason why, then it's all about promoting contract participation. One way of doing it is by making it compulsory, okay? Another way is by standardizing contracts so that participation in these contract markets is easier and less costly. Again, I don't want to spoil the second session of the course so that you go to a break wondering what is it that is making the difference, okay? So far, this is what the model is telling us, but this is not going to be the end of the story. So how do we introduce counterparty risk in this model? Again, in a very simple manner. We're going to assume that there's a fraction of the buyers who are trustworthy, and no matter what, they always honor the contract, okay? But there's a fraction gamma of buyers who I refer to them as opportunistic, who default on the contract as soon as the spot market price falls below the contract price. So say I sign a contract at 100 euro per megawatt hour, but then the spot market price is realized and the spot market price is 20. So I have a strong incentive to walk out of the contract instead of paying 100, pay electricity at 20. And there's a fraction gamma of buyers who are gonna do that as soon as the spot market price falls below F. So all those buyers that are not trustworthy or who are opportunistic, their expected profits are as follows. They're going to consume 1 unit of electricity and get the value of load load. And what is the price that they expect to pay? Well, if the spot market price is above, recall that phi is the cumulative distribution function of the spot market price. So 1 minus phi is the probability that P, the spot market price, is above the contract price. So if the spot market price is above, they are super happy. They keep on paying the fixed price, which is cheaper than the spot market price. But if the spot market price falls below the contract price, they say, you know what, I'd rather go and buy electricity in the spot market, which is cheaper. Yes?
But can they do that? Part of the contract, that they can default.
Yeah, so what we're going to assume, and in the paper we have the whole extension, is this is the opposite extreme, right? So they can default, and defaulting is for free. In reality, it is not for free, right? Typically, these contracts are backed with a collateral, so if you default, you lose the collateral, or you have some reputation penalties, so it is not for free, okay? So this is the one extreme in which it is for free, but please believe me that when you introduce this additional friction, many of the results remain unchanged. So in this case, if we had a collateral, say for instance K, you would not default as soon as the spot market price falls below F. You also take into account the fact that you're going to lose the collateral, so the probability of contract default goes down, but you have an additional cost, which is the cost of the collateral. Okay, but to make things simple, in the previous case, we analyzed the case in which it's impossible to default. The contracts are perfectly enforceable, and this is the case in which those who default, the non-trustworthy buyers, can default at no cost. Okay? What about the sellers? The sellers do not know the trustworthiness of the buyers. So if I'm trying to agree on a contract with a buyer, let's assume that they don't observe whether the buyer is going to default eventually or not. But they have some expectations. They believe that the probability that the buyer is non-trustworthy is equal to set, and those expectations at the end, when we compute the whole equilibrium, have to be true in equilibrium. So they think that the probability that they are facing a non-trustworthy buyer is equal to set. So what are the profits that they expect to make? Okay, so they expect to receive the contract price if two things occur. If the spot market price is above the contract price, and if the buyer is trustworthy. If the buyer is non-trustworthy and the contract price the spot market price falls below the contract price, in this case, instead of receiving F, they receive the spot market price, okay? So they agreed on a price F, but they know that down the road, there's a probability they're gonna receive P instead of F, P being lower than F, okay? Not only they know that, but also the bank is fully aware that in the presence of counterparty risk, the risk of default exists. And therefore, they're going to ask for a risk premium, which is going to be a function of how likely it is that buyers are non-trustworthy. And importantly, it's also a function of the contract price. Why? Because the higher the contract price, the more likely it is that there's going to be default, right? Because the more likely it is that the spot market price is going to fall below that, right? So the higher the contract price, the higher this premium is going to be, okay? Of course, in the extremes in which the probability of non-trustworthy buyers is 0, this R is equal to 0, and so on and so forth. So this risk premium, which I captured through this reduced form function R, is well behaved as one would expect it to be, okay? So let me, before going into the equilibrium, let me give you some properties of the equilibrium contract prices that we expect to see in the market, okay? The first one, your name was Diego, right? The first one has to do with what Diego said before. The equilibrium contract price that we are going to find in this market is going to be no greater than the expected spot market price. Why? Because if the sellers increase F above the expected spot market price, who are going to be willing to sign these contracts? Only the non-trustworthy opportunistic buyers. Because the opportunistic buyers, they're willing to sign any contract price. Why? Because if it turns out to be too high, they simply default and that's it, right? So if I increase the contract price above the expected spot market price, there's going to be what we economists refer to as adverse selection. The market is just going to, there's going to be adverse selection. And in the market, the only remaining buyers are going to be the bad buyers, okay? And I don't want to sell to the bad buyers because if I know that as soon as the spot market price falls below the contract price, there's going to be default, for that matter, I rather just go to the spot market because at least I can get the low and the high prices, right? So price above the expected spot market price, we are never going to see those in equilibrium because otherwise there's adverse selection. So this gives me an upper bound of the contract prices that I can see in equilibrium. What about the lower bound? Well, the lower bound is given by the seller's outside option constraint. I don't want to sign contract prices that are too low because for that matter, I would rather go to the spot market. So I need to check what is the indifference condition for the sellers between selling in the spot market and selling in the contract, okay? And this is giving me the lowest price at which sellers are willing to sign those contracts. This lower bound depends on the fraction of opportunistic buyers there is in the market. Because the more opportunistic buyers there is in the market, the less profitable the contract is going to be. So as the share of opportunistic buyers gamma increases, so does the lower bound for the contract price that the sellers are willing to sign. If there's many opportunistic buyers, the spot market becomes relatively more attractive because the contract is less profitable. So as we increase gamma, the lower bound of the contract prices goes up, okay? And there could be a situation in which if gamma is really high, if there's many opportunistic buyers, or if the probability of contract default is really high, we could find ourselves in situations in which the lowest price that sellers are willing to accept is above the highest price that buyers are willing to pay, in which case there is no contract market. Trade is impossible, okay? If I want to pay 10 and the other one is willing to accept only 12, there's no trade. It's a trade impossibility theorem. The contract market totally collapses, okay? So there's going to be a critical mass of opportunistic buyers above which we cannot have trading in long-term contract markets, okay? So it's truly, this possibility that down the road there's going to be default. If that possibility is very salient, is very large, there is not going to be long-term instruments whatsoever. Okay? So this is already explaining, why in many jurisdictions we don't find long-term trading at all. These markets fully collapse. Okay? Any question? What about if this share is not that high? So we have some opportunistic buyers, there's some probability of default, but it is not so large so as to totally make trading possible. What is the impact of counterparty risk on market clearing? Okay? So let's first look at how counterparty risk is affecting the supply of contracts. In the previous model, we saw that the supply for contracts was this function that is here denoted with a dashed line, right? So this part was the part for which the binding constraint was the spot market constraint, whereas in this region here, it was the break-even constraint, right? This is the case without counterparty risk. That is the case in which the share of opportunistic buyers is 0, okay? What about if we start adding some opportunistic buyers to our market? Well, our supply function shifts in, okay? Why does it shift in? Well, because, taking into account that there's going to be some probability of contract default, I truly need a higher contract price so that I break even. If I need to cover a cost equal to 10, without counterparty risk, maybe a contract price of 10 is enough. But if I know that there's counterparty risk, and I know that if I set a price of 10 with some probability, I'm going to get a price of 2, instead of setting a contract price at 10, I need to increase the contract price, say, to 15 to compensate for the fact that with some probability, I'm going to get lower revenues. So the more counterparty risk there is, the higher the share of opportunistic buyers they are, the higher the contract price that I need to break even, which is shifting the supply function upwards. That is, if I want to have a given level of investment, I need to have higher and higher and higher contract prices, the more counterparty the risk in this market. Is this clear? So now I know how counterparty risk is affecting my supply function, so I can see how this is affecting the market equilibrium. Okay? So let's first consider a case in which there's counterparty risk, but not too much. That is, gamma is not too high. Okay? So gamma is not too high. This is our supply function. Okay? And this is our demand function. Okay? So we have market clearing. That is, there's a contract price such that contract demand and contract supply are equal. Okay? So what is the effect of counterparty risk in this case? Well, counterparty risk, what it's doing, it is increasing the price of contracts. Without counterparty risk, we would have the equilibrium here, whereas with counterparty risk, we need a higher contract price to allow this mass of investors to break even. Okay? So contract prices are higher, which is making buyers worse off. Okay? It's making sellers better off. By the way, there's more counterparty risk, but because contract prices go up, inframarginal rents also go up. So the ones that paradoxically benefit from buyer counterparty risk is the sellers who pass on their increased default risk into the contract prices. The fact that contract prices go up does not simply mean a transfer of surplus from buyers to sellers. It also has efficiency consequences. Why? Because as we increase the contract price, we are also making default more likely. As we increase the contract price, then it's going to be more likely that eventually the spot market price is going to fall below this higher contract price. So we are making these investments more costly. We are, we are inducing banks to ask for higher risk premium because in this market in which the contract price is higher, the default probability is higher, and therefore the risk that sellers expose are higher. So it has efficiency consequences.
So do you assume that with higher contract price, also the proportion of non-trustworthy buyers decreases? Or not? Always the proportion is the same, the number of the...
Yeah, the gamma is exogenous, okay? So the increase in the contract price is affecting both trustworthy and untrustworthy.
So it's a gamma, it's not gamma as a function of F.
Sorry?
So it's a fixed gamma. It's not
It's a
gamma
fixed
as a
gamma.
function of f.
Gamma is an exogenous parameter, and gamma is affecting F star, that is the equilibrium contract price. So your question is very relevant because it implies that the opportunistic buyers, in a way, individually, they benefit from counterparty risk, right? Because when they default, it's because they are better off defaulting, okay? For sure, the ones that are worse off are the trustworthy buyers because they do not default and yet see higher contract prices. But collectively, even the non-trustworthy buyers are worse off. Why? Because it's true that they default when the spot market price is below the contract price, but because the contract price has gone up, collectively, they're worse off, okay? And paradoxically, let me stress this, the ones that are better off are the sellers. Because even though there's more default, they also charge higher prices for those contracts, and inframarginal rents go up.
So there's a positive feedback loop here. So is this really an equilibrium point?
It's a negative one,
Right.
a negative loop. Because I need to increase the contract price to compensate for default risk. And as I do that, default risk goes up. And this is fully captured here. So yes, there's an equilibrium. Yeah? So what about if gamma, again, an exogenous parameter, is even higher so that the supply function shifts up even more? We can find ourselves in this type of situations, okay, in which the market doesn't clear. The demand for contracts theta is above the maximum amount of contracts that sellers are willing to offer into that market. There's so much counterparty risk that the supply function has shifted up. Why? Because a given contract F that's not allowed to make high expected profits because there's a high probability of contract default. And there's a limit to how much I can increase prices to increase my revenues, because I can never increase prices above expected P, because if I do so, I end up only dealing with opportunistic buyers, which I totally dislike, okay? So at the highest possible contract price, which is expected P, the amount of investments that can break even at that price is truly constrained, and it is below the demand for contracts. So in this case, we have contract rationing. There is not enough contracts to satisfy the total contract demand, despite the fact that the contract price is the highest possible price that we might have, okay? So in this case, we have two sources of inefficiency. One source of inefficiency is that the contract price is super high, so the risk premium is very high. And the other very important source of inefficiency is the fact that we have underinvestment, okay? We can keep on increasing theta, but this is doing nothing to the equilibrium, because that is totally ineffective at promoting more contract liquidity, because contract liquidity is truly constrained not by participation, but rather by counterparty risk, okay? So when we say there's not enough contract liquidity, we already know a reason why, which is this trade impossibility theorem, okay? If gamma is not that large, we have an additional reason for why there's not enough contract liquidity. It's not just because participation is constrained. It's because counterparty risk is constraining the amount of contracts or the scale of the investments that can break even in a market with counterparty risk. Okay? Any questions? Yeah.
You mentioned you're not introducing any sort of penalty to walking out, but
It's by the way, it's in the paper. I'm not sure I brought it
Okay.
here with the backup slides, but I can show it to you later.
okay.
No, go.
If you introduce those, you see major changes in, because I assume that if those penalties are high enough, then you don't have the motivation to walk out of the contract, so it might affect the
Excellent.
equilibrium.
Even if I didn't bring the slides, let me try to make an effort and explain what is going on, even without the slides. You're absolutely right. If the collateral requirement is high enough, then you never want to default. Okay, you never want to default because what you can save by defaulting is not enough to compensate the loss of the collateral. So you can even reduce to zero the probability of default, okay? But that high collateral is very costly, and therefore is reducing the participation from the buyer side, because now entering into a contract becomes more costly, and therefore is reducing your willingness to enter into one of these contracts. So this is reducing demand, okay? Demand, instead of being inelastic as it is in here, it's downward sloping, okay? So if the demand for contracts goes down, it's true that you end up with risk-free contracts, but with very few of them. So the scale of the investments is also limited, to the point that it might be worse to have collateral requirements both from a welfare perspective as well as for sellers. Because for sellers, it is true that there is no probability of default. But with the reduction in demand, the contract price goes down so much that their profits go down. So if it were for the sellers, do they want to introduce collateral requirements? Well, for some parameter values, they don't. Does the social planner want to solve this market problem with collateral requirements? The answer is no, because there would be too little contracts. So what we claim is that, probably collateral requirements is not the silver bullet that is going to fix this market problem. I think there was a question down there. Is it okay? Yeah?
Is there a possibility for positive reinforcement that is not always with like negative collateral, but a way of allowing buyers to have a way of kind of like a hedge that is more positive? One example I'm thinking of is there a possibility that why buyers are or for opportunistic buyers that have a tendency to jump back to the spot market because the prices are lower, but a policy framework that support them with maybe having a way of storing those energies in a way that they can also participate in the spot market to make some money while they retain the long-term contract, but they use this price difference because they could maybe store energy during the time that the long-term costs are cheaper, and then they don't have a tendency to jump out of their contract, but they can sell something like this.
What you are describing resonates a lot with two extensions that we have in the paper, and for that matter, I think they're also very relevant. One of them has to do with the fact that here I'm modeling a purely static contract. That is, it is just a one period. But typically, these contracts last for many years, and during the contract duration, there's many spot market realizations, right? So if I default as soon as spot market prices fall below the contract price, it means I'm out of the contract, and therefore I'm not hedged against future spot market price realizations that might be above the contract price. That is, there's a value of staying into the contract and not defaulting, as soon as spot market prices go down. So when we allow for, longer contract duration, the longer contract duration somehow is disciplining the buyers not to default as soon as possible. And we can model that the default probabilities go up over time. As you get closer to the end of the contract, the value of staying in the contract is lower, and therefore the willingness to default is higher. This is one extension. The other extension has to do with the value that the buyer attaches to the contract, what we refer to as a kind of green premium, okay? I not only care about the contract price, I also care about the fact that, I can report that I'm buying green because I can report that I have this PPA with a renewable power plant, right? So this would give a buyer an incentive not to default as soon as possible, and this would be aligning the incentive of buyers and sellers. But this is something, I don't know what policy can do regarding this, you see, other than, it would be kind of the good buyers, the ones that attach a lot of value to staying in the contract. We don't think we can truly rely on this because probably the amount of buyers with this green premium is not as large as one would expect. But certainly, there's many angles to this problem, and what we like about this approach is that it's extremely simple, but we can use this core simple model to extend it in many different directions to incorporate some of the very relevant issues that you are discussing.
I think he was talking about strike prices and options.
Yes.
That you don't have a fixed price all the time, but if you see that the spot price is super high, then you can say, okay, now the fixed prices change or something like that.
Yeah, so you can make these contracts more flexible, but it also means that the default probability is not going to be as high, but it also means that the seller is exposed to some sort of price volatility. So you see there's a trade-off, because if you allow for this, you're avoiding default, but you're exposed, you're not removing all the price volatility from the seller. So there might be a sweet spot where, it's not, but you would not. So in a way, you can think of this R, if you want, right, as the increased risk premium. If you, with some probability, this option contract kicks in and you are exposed to the spot market price. So you can think of this in a similar way as well. Good. So if we put all these results together to summarize the welfare effects of counterparty risk and the welfare effects of contracts, we find that relative to the no contract case, that is when we rely only in spot markets, fixed price contracts are welfare improving. So when the European Commission is promoting long-term contracts, they have a good reason for doing that. There is an economic rationale for supporting the use of long-term contracts. Why? Because they reduce sellers' risk exposure and therefore mitigate underinvestment. The question is this enough? Is this going to take us to the first best? And the answer is not. Relative to the perfect contract enforcement case, if there is counterparty risk, fixed price contracts are going to take us short of the first best. Why? Because we still have underinvestment due to counterparty risk. Sellers are not harmed by counterparty risk, as we argue before. They are only hurt in the case of contract rationing because they don't get to invest as much as they could. But buyers are collectively harmed if counterparty risk is sufficiently large. Okay? So we have a market failure. We don't have enough of these contracts, either because participation is low, or even if participation is high, if there's a lot of counterparty risk, we do not reach the scale of the investments that we need. Okay? So this market failure is opening up the door to public policies aimed at supporting these renewable energy investments and providing more contract liquidity. For instance, going back to the European Commission's document, the European Commission's document is asking member states to ensure that instruments to reduce the financial risk associated to the buyer defaulting on its long-term payment obligations are accessible to companies that face entry barriers to the PPA market and that are not in a financial difficulty. Okay? So the European Commission is fully aware of the impact of this risk of buyer default, and is asking member states to providing financial guarantees to cover for this risk of default. Okay? It's asking member states to provide guarantee schemes at market prices, okay, as well as public support for non-fossil fuel PPAs. Okay? This is just an example of the type of policies that are being discussed, but these are not certainly the only ones. Okay? So in practice, in Europe and beyond, we find many other examples of policies that are either implemented or under discussion to promote long-term contracts. One of them is to promote demand for contracts, and before we discuss ways in which we can promote demand for contracts through standardization or through obligations, renewal portfolio standards in the US, or other sort of obligations on the load serving entities. What we find in our analysis is that in the presence of counterparty risk, increasing contract demand is not always optimal, because you increase contract demand, you increase the contract price, you're making buyers worse off, and by increasing the contract price, you're increasing the risk premium. So it's true you have more investments, but all of them, including the inframarginal ones, become more risky. Okay? So in the presence of counterparty risk, it is unclear whether promoting contract demand is truly the optimal way to go. Okay? One way to promote long-term contracts is to say, okay, if the problem is counterparty risk, let's have a risk-free counterparty. Who is a risk-free counterparty? Well, a public entity or the regulator. Why? Because they have the enforcement ability to make consumers pay a contract price, even when that contract price is above the spot market price. So it's truly the enforcement ability of the public entity that guarantees or reduces the probability of contract defaults. If I reduce counterparty risk, sellers are going to be willing to offer or to enter into contracts at lower prices, and therefore their reduction in the risk is eventually passed on to buyers because the equilibrium contract price is gonna be reduced. Okay, so these regulator-backed contracts serve as a way to more efficiently allocate risk. Do we want to allocate risk on sellers? No, because they are risk averse. So a more efficient risk allocation is to reduce risk from sellers, have the public entity have that risk because eliminate that risk really because there's no risk because I can always make final consumers pay for that, and this is going to increase investment and social welfare, and I'm going to elaborate more on this by introducing what I refer to as regulator-backed contracts. You can refer to them as CFDs into the model. Okay. Something else that we do is we analyze capacity subsidies. What about if we provided public support? In the quote of the European Commission, they were referring to public support to non-fossil PPAs, okay? So what could this public support be? It could well be, regulators saying, Jahal, if you invest in a new asset, in a new renewable asset, and you enter into a PPA, I'm going to give you a capacity subsidy. We analyze that as well. We see how those capacity subsidies translate into lower contract prices, but of course these are costly, right? Because we are, making the regulator pay, and those public funds can be costly, and this is something that has to be taken into account. And something else that we could do, and that is high up in the regulatory discussions, is to provide financial public guarantees, okay? So that in case of default, the state says, if the spot market price falls below F, don't you worry, you're going to keep on receiving F because I am going to be making up for the difference, okay? In the paper, we analyze all these policies through the lenses of the model. What I'm going to do is just give an illustration of what we do with regulator-backed contracts, and then I'm going to show you the comparison of all these policy alternatives through the lenses of the simulation exercise that we conduct. Okay? Regulator-backed contracts. You've been you had the session with Paul. You went through these contract for differences that are being auctioned off in several countries. Certainly, the UK was one of the very first countries where they auction off contract for differences. But since then, we have seen CFDs in Italy, in Spain, in Romania, in many different countries. So as you know, these are long-term contracts, typically lasting from 10 to 15 years, so that whoever wins the auction wins a contract at a fixed price. The strike price is typically set through the auction. So, so here, for instance, you have the results of a renewable auction that took place in Spain in 2021. So here you have the demand. These are the winning bids. So the demand in the auction was 3,000 megawatts. So here you have the strike prices of the winning projects. The blue dots representing the wind power plants, and the red dots representing the solar power plants. And as you can see, there was quite a lot of heterogeneity in the bids that were submitted in the auction, from around 18 euro per megawatt hour to 28 euro per megawatt hour. This is a pay-as-bid auction, so one of the puzzles was why is it that we didn't see more bunching around the market clearing price. So there were many projects that were leaving quite a lot of money on the table because they were getting less than the market clearing price. And this is the allocation of all the projects. So there was a large winner in the wind segment that got most of the wind capacity, but the solar allocation was much more spread across the winners. Okay, so this is what we refer to as a regulator-backed contract. Whoever wins in this auction knows for sure that during the 12 years of the contract, okay, they're going to get the price which they offer in the auction. So they know for sure their F. They know that the regulator is not going to default on its payment obligations, even if future spot market prices in Spain fall below the, I don't know, the 28 euro that some of these projects won. Okay, and these projects, after winning this auction, they've gone to the banks and say, you know, this is my collateral. My collateral is this risk-free contract, and please give me a loan with good financial conditions. Okay. Yeah.
At what basis they compete to get CFD from the regulator? So
What
how
do you
they
mean?
Compete?
How do they compete?
Yeah, you have now, I don't know, 10, 20 suppliers, and they compete to get this CFD, this support from the regulator. So how did they compete? So
It's a seal bid auction, so they have to submit their bids at a certain date, and then the regulator opens up the seal bids, that is, goes to the software and checks the bids that were submitted, ranks them from low to high, and determines what is the allocation. As simple as that. Okay. So what we find in the model is that the regulator-backed contracts are sold at lower prices than the private contracts, and not only that, they don't have a risk premium, and therefore the investments are less costly. It is true that they might crowd out private investments or private contracts. So this is one of the criticisms to CFDs. But we don't want to have either private or public. What we want is investments, right? If we already have investments supported by regulator-backed contracts, it means that we need less of these. So the fact that we have less private contracts need not be a bad outcome. Okay. One of the problems, however, so from the positive side, regulator-backed contracts eliminate counterparty risk for all those investments that are covered by the regulator-backed contracts. They increase contract demand, and therefore they open up the door to more investments, reducing under investments. The downside is that because contract demand is higher, the price of private contracts goes up, and therefore the private contract market not only is thinner, but it's also riskier because the contract price has gone up, and therefore the risk of the private contracts has also gone up. So one has to assess whether this negative impact is offset or not by the positive results. And what we find is that in any event, it is better to promote contract demand. So if we want to have more contracts, it's better to do so by increasing publicly supported contract demand than by increasing private contract demand through obligations or the like. Okay. So if we rely, So if we rely more on these sort of regulator-backed contracts, it means that the regulator has to decide how to auction off these contracts and has to define some of the characteristics of these contracts. So there is quite a lot of research from the economic point of view regarding, for instance, auction design. Okay? So one of the issues that I've been working on has to do with, who do we want to, which plants do we want to have competed in the same auction? Do we want to have technology-neutral auction so that both solar, wind, and whatever compete in the same market? Or do we want to have technology-specific auction, say one auction for only wind, one auction for only solar? What are the trade-offs? And I'm going to be showing you some of the results of our paper later on. One of the questions that we need to decide is whether we want to pay for capacity or we want to pay for output. Are we determining a price per megawatt hour produced, or we determine a capacity payment per megawatt, okay? And there are several issues here, as you can imagine, but the one that I think stands out is that if we pay for capacity, we are not going to induce the optimal location decisions, because investing in 1 megawatt of wind in a windy place is the same as investing in 1 megawatt of wind in a place which is not windy, and we certainly want to promote efficient locations. We want that megawatt to be installed in the windy location. If we pay the same regardless of production, we are not incentivizing optimal production decisions, okay? Do we want to go for price-only auctions, or do we also want to take into account other attributes? This is now high up in the policy discussions. If, for instance, we want to promote local content or European-made equipment, or we want to promote recycled materials, right? Not only we want to make sure that the least cost investments are carried out, but we also want to promote these additional benefits that come with non-price attributes. How to do it, okay? How can we organize auctions in which we are scoring different attributes and not only a price? And this is, I would say, an exciting topic for research, which is not yet settled, that is very important for policy making these days. I'm also starting to work on some of these issues, and I'm happy to discuss about those. Just one hint, which is, if suppose that we have, the same technology, let's say wind, so we are running an auction for wind farms, and there are some projects that, provide local benefits and the other ones don't, right? If we run a price-only auction, the auction is going to be clear solely on the basis of the cost of these plants, without internalizing the different local benefits that these projects provide. And therefore, we might be getting the least cost allocation, which need not be the best one from a welfare perspective, because the local benefits are not internalized, right? Therefore, this calls for indeed taking that into account, but how should we do it? Should we have this local content as a requirement to participate in the auction? Or should we let the bidders be free as to how much of these local benefits they provide and somehow weight it into the allocation rule? And how do we know how much are we willing to give up in terms of prices for these local benefits? The answers to these questions are certainly not trivial, and I think are worth investigating. Another element which is very important when it comes to auction design is the auction rule itself. Do we want to pay as bid, as in the Spanish case, in which we pay each winner the strike price that they were bidding? Or do we want to use a uniform price format so that we pay all the bidders according to the highest accepted bid? And this is something that has been, as you know, studied for a long time, certainly in the context of the spot market. It's also something that the first chapter of my PhD thesis back in the last century was precisely about this topic. And where it's kind of clear in the absence of market power, because under a pay-as-bid system, if there's perfect information and the market is perfectly competitive, you would expect bidders to bid at the expected market clearing price, therefore flat bids, and have the same market clearing price. In the presence of asymmetric information or in the presence of market power, this need not be the case. So the main takeaway is that when there is market power, uniform price auctions are more vulnerable to market power, okay? Because with pay-as-bid, also the inframarginal bids have to be competing at the margin, and therefore they're more conducive to more competitive outcomes. Again, the same type of issue might well arise in the context of regulator and bank contracts. So we have to design the auction format, but we also have to design the contract that we want to auction off. A critical issue is how much price exposure we want to embed in the contract. Do we really want to have a fixed price contract that is and insulating the producers from exposure to spot market prices? And in general, the answer is no, because exposure to spot market prices also provides and informative signals. On the one hand, it brings in risky, exposure to volatile prices, which is bad, as we just discussed. But on the other hand, for some plants, it might also have an incentive component, right? So for instance, I want to know whether I want to go for a scheduled maintenance at times of high prices or at times of low prices, okay? If I'm receiving a fixed price, I cannot care less. I know I need to be off 1 month a year, and, who cares? And not even that. If I am part of a bigger portfolio of a big firm, I would rather go on maintenance at times of very high prices so that prices go up even more to the benefit of all the other plants that are under the same ownership, okay? So I could even induce very wrong incentives. Whereas if I introduce some sort of price exposure in my long-term contract, this is giving me the incentives to go in maintenance periods at times when spot market prices are low, and therefore I am giving up low spot market prices rather than high. So typically some degree of price exposure is optimal, which will depend on the attributes of the plant, okay? So for instance, if we are thinking about the storage, we want to give full price exposure. Why? Because we really want the storage facility to respond to differences in the spot market prices. Whereas if we are thinking of a country in which there's equal amount of the solar resource across the same country, so location is not an issue, right? And solar farms can only produce when it's sunny and that's it, and therefore they don't have much flexibility to decide when they produce or not. In that case, providing price exposure is useless and would be creating a cost without an incentive benefit, right? So in that case, it's better not to have price exposure. So this calls for something that I have been advocating for, that Paul Josko has also been advocating for, which is attribute-based contract design, okay? One size does not fit all. Why? Because not all feet are of the same size. If you have a bigger feet, you need a bigger shoe. If you have a smaller feet, you need a smaller shoe. So contract design should be attribute-based.
Sorry, I have a naive question. So if I manage to get a regulator-backed contract with government or regulator, what is the motivation for me to find the PPA and sign a PPA with
because maybe there's not enough. Maybe there's not enough of those contracts, right? So there's still some market out there if the regulator doesn't decide. So in this simple model, the best would be to have a regulator that auction off the optimal amount of contracts that we need, because this is the best way to have risk-free contracts and make sure that there's enough contract liquidity. But for some reason which is outside of the model, and I think it's a political economy type of reason, that's not what regulators are doing. I think regulators are truly falling behind for reasons that I cannot explain, are falling behind into how many CFDs they are auctioning off. In that case, then there's a complementary role for the private market to provide those contracts that the regulator is not providing, okay? But that would be a sort of regulatory failure, and the private market, offsetting that regulatory failure. If we had well-behaved regulators doing their job, private contracts would not have a role to play.
I don't know if you know the Brazilian market.
Which one, sorry?
Brazil.
Very little. I was in Brazil. I was invited to give a talk in Brazil this Christmas time, so I was more exposed to it, and I think it's a super interesting market to analyze.
Because we have two contract markets. One is the regulated market, and the other is the free market. The regulated market is more or less similar to this regulated vacant contracts market. It's been operating since 2000, so it's 25 years of. But it is restricted to, I don't know if you know, but it is restricted to medium voltage and low voltage consumers, which are consumers that are associated with a distribution company. And contracts, there are auctions for generators compete and participate in auctions to sell to the distribution companies, and the distribution companies passes the cost to the consumers. And the contracts in this market are very low, long term. So 15 years, 20 years, maybe 40 years for hydro, big hydros. And what is happening is that the price of the electricity for this consumer is higher than for consumers in the free market. The free market is a bilateral contract market.
I'm surprised about that result.
Yes, and in January 2024, to migrate, you can migrate from this regulated market to the free market, but there are limitations. So
why is it that the private market is cheaper? They think that the state is riskier than the private companies?
I think it's because of the companies. They have portfolios. So if you are an investor, you invest, you have some plants in the regulated market, and you have a fixed price. So you can manage very well your investment.
So you should be able to offer a discount because of that reason, not a premium.
Then you go to the free market and you can take advantage of the volatility of the price, which is associated with the hydro conditions, because Brazil is mainly hydro. So I think that's why both markets exist. And what is happening is that in 2024, this regulated market, the free market was open to medium voltage consumers. So many are migrating to this free market, and energy is cheaper. So,
but what I'm puzzled about is the fact that it's cheaper, because if it's volatile, it means that if they are willing to offer lower prices because they are risk-loving, not risk-averse.
Contracts are typical contracts at 5 years. Contract and few of them are 8 year long, so they are not very long. And I think it's because of the to take advantage of the volatility of.
It means they're risk loving,
but it's lower. And what I'm thinking is, how can you obtain because the regulated market is important, because this evidence is not what we see in Europe, where we see, as you saw the prices, where we see that the prices at which these contracts are being offered are well below the prices at which the PPAs are being traded. So the evidence in Europe is that the CFDs with the state as the counterparty are much cheaper than the prices of the private PPAs. So if you use the figures in our paper, for instance, this is the supply contract for the supply function for regulated back contracts, because these are free of counterparty risk. This is the supply function for contracts with counterparty risk. So if we have this total demand for contracts, this is going to be the equilibrium price for regulated back contracts, and this is going to be the equilibrium price for private contracts. So what we get out of the model is in line with the evidence that we get in Europe, which is regulated back contracts are sold at lower prices than the private contracts. Yeah, well, I think it deserves a
analysis. For sure, for sure. Maybe there's differerences that explain why that's not what you observe in Brazil. So, I was talking about contract design, okay? And so let me just comment on 2 additional issues which I think are worth mentioning. I've been talking about price volatility and price risk, but we might also have quantity risk. We might also have quantity risk in case of curtailment, okay? So if there's no curtailment at all, we know that in expected terms, the production of a solar power plant is relatively stable, over the lifetime of the project, according to the expected number of hours of production of a given site, right? There could be differences across the year, but over the lifetime, that is quite stable. But if there's curtailment, either because of local congestion or because there's excess renewable production in the system, then the quantity is no longer certain. There might be volatility, there might be uncertainty as to how much these plants are going to be producing, and we need to understand whether the contract that we auction off is providing for insurance against a curtailment or not. Who ends up paying for curtailment? That is an important element, because if we don't pay for curtailment, the equilibrium price in the auction is going to be higher, right? If we pay for curtailment, it means that consumers have to be paying the strike price, even at times when that energy is not being consumed. So there are trade-offs here that have to be taken into account when designing the contract. Do we want to produce quantity insurance or not? Yes.
Thank you very much. Just an anecdote, maybe you will get to this, because in line with this quantity insurance, ensuring that there is existing mechanism in Europe. Of course, our countries are entitled to come up with their own concept of regulatory-backed contract to support long-term investment, but there is also existing policy framework in the regulation that encourages coordination of long-term procurement contract backed by regulators. It's a part of the capacity mechanism. It's called a maximum entry capacity, where countries or bidding zones try to jointly assess how the resource we propagate or demand we propagate in the future for very long term, and then try to use long-term studies from the European perspective in order to plan, to allocate capacity that they want to procure, or at least help investors. So, for example, I know countries like Poland, RTE is doing this, and also I think Belgium earlier, and they are coordinating, taking into consideration the flows across countries and trying to use.
But you're referring to capacity mechanisms, right?
Yes, capacity mechanism.
Not to CFDs for renewables.
But I understand it that somehow it compensates.
Yeah, it's the same family.
Right.
If the question is, should we integrate more markets and run these auctions at a level beyond the national borders, the answer is absolutely yes. Okay. I would like to see these CFDs being auctioned off at the European level. It doesn't make any sense, and please forgive me because it might seem that I'm biased because of my own country, but it doesn't make any sense from an efficiency perspective that we invest so much in solar in Denmark or in Germany and less so in Italy or Spain, because clearly the investment is more productive if we locate it at the resourceful location.
Yes.
So by splitting the auctions across member states, we are giving rise to inefficiencies. We are not doing an efficient allocation of the investments. If we go up and organize European-wide auctions, the outcome would be much better. When it comes to renewables, when it comes to storage, when it comes to capacity mechanisms.
Yes, and again, it helps with this quantity insurance challenge with curtailment, because, I mean, the methodology is public methodology, how they come up with these, not only what to invest, but the quantity to procure. And these, the existing methodology is they are looking at era studies, and they are targeting time frames where there was energy not served, and then they are focused on these time frames that we have lower chances of having curtailment issue, and then they target this quantity procurement across that time, and then look for people to bid across those time frames in order to reduce the challenges with, okay, if you procure too much quantity and then you suffer.
So what you are describing, I think, is super interesting and super insightful, and goes in line with the idea that when it is the regulator that is organizing these auctions and designing these contracts, there's a scope for doing things better. Whereas if we solely rely on contracts that are negotiated privately, all these externalities that you are mentioning are not internalized into the private contracts, because those private contracts satisfy the needs of the contracting parties without internalizing the externalities on the whole system. Okay, so thank you very much, because I think it provides very relevant insight on the underlying question. Right? Any additional comments? Good. So, good.
Okay. How often would you not expose, or what are the reasons why you would not expose people to the spot price, even if they're hedged?
What do you mean? Even if they are hedged, they don't need. They are hedged. So I mean, the reason why I don't want to expose them is to reduce risk, and the reason why I want to expose them is to provide, an efficient signal to the extent that they can respond to the signal. I have a new paper on my website, which is called Designing Long-Term Contracts for the Energy Transition, and I didn't bring the content of this super recent paper, and there we built a model in which we can capture this trade-off, taking into account risk aversion and moral hazard, taking into account the efficiency of this response.
Well, without exposure to spot prices, you get an inefficiency, because if I'm just contracted at a fixed price and not allowed to sell that energy back into the market, I may not, I may be more profitable selling it back into the market rather than consuming it myself. Is that the exposure we're talking about?
No, I'm talking about exposure to how much or how we pay the producers. Do we pay them a fixed price? Or do we pay them a price that is somehow linked or indexed to the spot market price?
But I'm always exposed to the spot market price.
No, because you can be hedged through a fixed price contract. The extent is, the question is the extent, which is the optimal degree of price exposure.
If I have a fixed price contract, can I sell that back into the market?
Yeah, you can. Yeah.
Okay, I'm exposed to the spot market price.
Yeah, but you have a two-way contract for differences, so that if the spot market price is above, so here it is a financial contract, so you are selling everything in the spot market. The question is whether you are hedged or not through a financial contract.
Yeah, I don't understand when you wouldn't be exposed to the spot market price.
You are always exposed. The question is whether you are hedged or not. If you are exposed and hedged, it is as if you are not exposed. So, in order to compare these public policies, in order to provide some orders of magnitude, when we analyze the policies theoretically, there's trade-offs. So we want to quantify these trade-offs, and we do so in the context of the Spanish market. So this is a figure just showing the generation of the different technologies. Spain is a country that is truly going through a very rapid energy transition. So we started investing in wind and solar very rapidly at the same time as we completely phased out all our coal power plant. So Spain is a country where we have had quite a few investments in renewables over the few years, and many of these investments, some of them, have been backed by PPAs, okay? So if you look at PPA contracting in Europe, certainly Spain is one of the countries where most of these PPAs have been signed. So we think it's a natural setup where to analyze the relevance of the several policies that could be put in place, okay? So what do we do to calibrate the model? We go to 2022 and look at the plants that are started operating in Spain by 2022. You can see how they are spread out across the country with the size of the circle representing the size of the power plant, either wind or solar. Solar is in light green. And then we say these plants that are started operating in 2022, probably, it lasted for construction lasted for a year. So we're going to look at 2021 investment cost by using, as you know, the very useful reports by Irina. So this is going to give us the investment cost at that time for the different plants. And with the geolocations of the different power plants and their specific technology, then we can compute the expected lifetime production of those plants. So if we have the investment cost and we have the expected Q, we can compute the expected average cost of each of these plants, which is an important element of the model, is our C, our little c in the model. And we also need to compute the utility or the expected sellers' profits that they would obtain if only selling in the spot market versus selling in the long-term contract market. So here we are very bold. We assume that spot market prices have a mean equal to 40 euro, which was the price at which futures were trading at that time. And we use several distribution functions around 40. In particular, we assume a beta distribution with some parameters. And in order to incorporate risk premium, we assume that sellers have what we refer to as mean variance preferences, which is simply a utility function that puts weight on the mean on the expected price, and a negative weight on the volatility of those prices to incorporate risk aversion. So with these two elements, we have expected investment costs, expected spot market revenues, and therefore we can construct for different assumptions on the amount of opportunistic buyers in the market, the supply functions at which these sellers would be willing to enter into a PPA. Okay? So before I do that, just some information. So when we compute the average cost of the plants that started operating in Spain in 2022, these are the average costs that we get. So ranging from something below 20 to something around 40, which is a very reasonable range, and not very different from what we got in the 2021 auction. So for us, kind of this is some reassuring that we are not very off regarding the average cost. So with this average cost and these expected spot market revenues, through the lenses of our model, we can construct the supply functions of contracts, the supply functions of PPAs for different shares of opportunistic buyers. And as we saw in the theory model, as we increase the share of opportunistic buyers, the supply function of contract shifts in, that is, given quantities being offered, given contract quantities being offered at higher contract prices. So if we consider, for instance, a fixed demand for PPAs, the higher the share of opportunistic buyers, the higher is going to be the expected market clearing price for contracts, which for a demand of, in this case, 3,000 would give us contract prices at around 25, and higher contract demand would give us higher market clearing contract prices. Okay? So with these ingredients, then we say, what would happen in this market without any public intervention, and what would happen in this market with the various market interventions that we consider in the model. Okay? So the first thing that we do is we consider what would be the equilibrium contract price and total investment when we have different amounts of counterparty risk. So here on the x-axis, you have the value of gamma that goes from 0 to 0.5, and we consider different amount of demand for contracts, low, medium, and high contract demand. That is low, medium, and high participation from the buyer side. And what we find is that counterparty risk weakly increases contract prices, and the effect is really pronounced when contract demand is high. So we promote participation, we have higher contract prices, and the impact of counterparty risk is much higher, to the point that if we have high counterparty risk, there's going to be contract rationing. The contract price is going to go up, all the way up to the expected spot market price, and we are not going to have as much investment as we would like, because there is so much counterparty risk that truly, even at the price of 40, the amount of sellers that can break even at that price goes down. So the scale of investment goes down. This is about contract prices and equilibrium investment without any intervention. if we look at sellers and buyers surplus, we get, I would say, a very interesting result. And I think, is it Julia? She asked me about this during the break, and this is the answer to your question. What happens to buyers and sellers? Well, as we increase counterparty risk, sellers are really better off. Why? Because as we increase counterparty risk, we saw that prices go up, and therefore their profits go up. Their profits only go down when there's contract rationing, that is, when counterparty risk is reducing the scale of their investments. But the ones that are really worst off, are the buyers, because as gamma goes up, as there are more opportunistic buyers, because contract prices go up, also their surplus goes down. Not only they don't get as many contracts as they would like to buy, but also those contracts that they buy it at much higher prices, okay? If we put sellers and buyers surplus together to look at total welfare impacts, then we see that when contract demand is high, an increasing counterparty risk really reduces investment. So as we increase contract demand, it is true welfare goes up. So promoting participation is good when counterparty risk is low. But when counterparty risk is high, promoting contract demand is reducing welfare, because the impact on contract prices and therefore the impact on the risk premium is much stronger and more than offsets the positive impact of having more contract demand. Okay? So promoting contract demand without addressing the root cause of the problem, which is counterparty risk, can be counterproductive, okay? Not only we need to promote contract demand, but we need to do something else to truly address the root cause, which is counterparty risk. So what can we do? We can put in place some policies, and one of the policies that has been proposed is public guarantees. I have to admit that before running these simulations, I was very negative about public guarantees. I thought this is totally unfair. So the companies, they get the profit, and it is the public entity that is paying for the default. This is kind of privatizing the benefits and socializing the cost. So I was extremely very negative about this, and I have to say that the simulation changed my mind regarding this result. And let me explain you why. What do public guarantees do? Here, in this figure, what you have is prices relative to the baseline without public guarantees. What do the public guarantees do? They reduce counterparty risk for the sellers. So when there's a lot of counterparty risk, contract prices go down relative to the baseline without contracts. And in the case of very high contract demand, the reduction in prices can be very substantial. Sellers offer contracts at lower prices because they don't have the risk. So consumers benefit, okay, because contract prices go down. And because contract prices go down, the probability of contract default also goes down. So the public entity is going to be paying for the default, but it's going to be paying for the default with a much lower probability, because just the fact of removing risk from the sellers is enough to reduce contract prices so much to the extent that the probability of contract default really goes down. So I promise to pay, but the fact that I promise to pay implies that I will be paying with a much lower probability, okay? With the byproduct, which is very positive, of reducing contract prices all the time, okay? And because I'm doing that, I'm also inducing more investments than otherwise. Now sellers don't have that risk, and therefore they are willing to invest more, particularly so in cases in which without these financial guarantees, if there's a lot of counterparty risk, that would be contract rationing. So if we put these things together and look at the impact on consumers and in the impact of welfare, we see that the increase in consumer surplus can be very substantial in those markets in which there's a lot of counterparty risk. And also welfare goes up, both because there's more investment, but also because there's less probability of default and therefore lower risk premium, okay? So what we're doing with public guarantees, we are reallocating risk more efficiently to the point that there's a Pareto improvement. That is, sellers are better off, consumers are better off, and total welfare goes up. Okay, so I had to reconsider my initial thoughts.
What's the difference between the CFD and public guarantees? Is it the same?
No. Public guarantees is public guarantees on private contracts. Okay, so if you and me, we sign a private PPA, and if down the road I default, the state is going to compensate you for the difference between the contract price and the spot market price. So it's completely different, because CFD is the state is the counterparty. Public guarantees it is a private contract with the state providing the public guarantee. We also compare CFDs and PPAs with financial guarantees. CFDs are better than PPAs with public guarantees, to be sure, okay? Because that's a way of eliminating the risk and not devoting any public resources to paying for these public guarantees. So to be clear, according to these results, according to the model, CFDs are better than PPAs with public guarantees, but PPAs with public guarantees are better than PPAs without. That's the point. Yes.
Thank you. From the point of view of the model, you mentioned that you were using the average prices of 21 as of future contracts. So I was wondering, on the second half of 21, we already saw a huge increase of prices as part of the crisis when the supply was trying to catch up with the demand in the global markets. And then, of course, 22, this exploded with the Russian invasion. But I was wondering if this could also impact the results of the model, and what if we use different prices, for example, from the pre-crisis or the current?
You can do the simulations with different assumptions on the cost parameters, on the price parameters, on the distribution of the expected prices. This is an illustration to quantify the model results. So the model results are what they are, regardless of parameter values. What the simulation is doing is providing some orders of magnitude to quantify, potentially in this context, the various effects that could be countervailing.
Yes, because I was wondering, because now we clearly have more volatility than we used to have pre-crisis, so I was wondering if this also would impact that.
Of course, if here I have price distributions with greater volatility, the utility of the sellers, the relative utility of the sellers of going into a contract relative to the spot market would go up, and they would be willing to offer lower contract prices. So the social benefits of having PPAs versus not having them would be greater.
We are going to finish in like 10 minutes, so maybe we can let Natalia finish, and then we can ask questions.
Good. In this exercise, what we do is we compare public support to public guarantees. That is, what if I pay a capacity payment to those investors who invest and enter into a PPA? And what we do to make the comparison meaningful is that the amount of public support that we give is such that the total public expenditure is the same as the public expenditure that I have with public guarantees. So I'm keeping constant, I'm taking as given the amount of public expenditure that we give, okay? So for different values of gamma, I'm comparing welfare with subsidies and public guarantees. So 100% means that welfare is exactly the same with the two policies, and values below 100 means that welfare is higher with public guarantees than with subsidies. And what this analysis clearly shows is that given public guarantees is better than giving public subsidies, even when we keep total expenditure the same. And the reason being that when you give public support, you're given this with probability 1, okay? You are giving it to all the investors who invest, whereas with the public guarantees, you only pay it once the default occurs. And because you are removing the risk, the probability of default goes down, and therefore sellers are willing to offer those contracts at lower prices as compared to the prices at which they are willing to offer contracts with the public subsidy. So if we were constrained between resorting to public subsidies versus public guarantees, we would advocate for the former. I haven't brought the results because we just completed those results comparing regulator back contracts and all the others. And the conclusion is clearly regulator back contracts dominate, are welfare improving relative to the other ones. I don't have the time to cover all the material that I brought, so all I'm going to tell you is if you want to check that material, the type of material that you're going to find in the slides. We didn't cover two things. One is the comparison between technology neutral and technology specific auctions. You can check the material, you can check the simulations, you can check the paper. The spoiler is that as a good economist, it depends, right? It depends on parameter values. If the technologies are very different, having technology neutral auctions can give rise to very large inframarginal rents. It might be good for efficiency, but it is too costly, okay? So if we care about consumers, if we care about how much can we do with a given budget, in that case, it's better to go for technology-specific auction. But if the regulator has very little information about the cost of these technologies, it might get it wrong and say, you know, the amount that I auction off for wind and solar, maybe this allocation is very inefficient because the regulator is ill-informed. In those type of situations, it's better to let the market design be technology neutral and see which is the winning technology. So at least this is a framework that allows you to pin down what are the relevant parameters and factors that need to be taken into account when deciding whether you want to go technology neutral or technology specific. For sure, what we rule out is that the paradigm of everything should be technology neutral. This should not be a universal principle. Sometimes technology neutrality is dominated by technology-specific approaches and hybrid formats in between, such as bundling or auctions with minimum quotas. And the other thing that I didn't cover, let me go fast here. The other thing that I didn't cover, which has to do with previous question, which is the optimal amount of price exposure. And when you want to give price exposure, if you give price exposure, how do you want to do it? Do you want to give a capacity payment? And in essence, you know, the whole family of contracts that you could get out of combining capacity payments, CFDs with different reference prices, price exposure, and the trade-offs that are involved in this exercise. So I'm really sorry that we didn't cover everything, but at least we had the time to go through very interesting discussions. So I'm really grateful for your time and attention and would be happy to discuss further issues if we have the time. Thank you.
Maybe we can take two quick questions, if there are any. Yeah, Marco.
Thank you, Natalia, for the presentation. Very quickly, if you could elaborate on the possible market distortion that we have with long-term contracts in the short-term contracts, if you know, on a high level.
Yeah, I think this question is extremely relevant, and this is what is covered in the last part of the session. So many potential distortions which can be addressed through market design. So let me stress that the fact that we have distortion doesn't mean that we have to give up on those contracts. A straightforward one, if we pay a fixed price, the plant is going to be willing to produce as long as the spot market price is equal to minus the fixed price, and therefore we produce at times when more efficient technologies are available to produce instead. This is clearly the case, for instance, with renewables. When prices go negative, this is clearly below their marginal cost, even if it is zero. So we should have these plants stopping because it's more costly, say, for the nuclear power plants to stop rather than for them. How can this be avoided? Well, with price floors at zero. So if the spot market price falls below zero, then the contract is not going to be in place, and this removes the incentives for producing at times prices are negative. An additional distortion is what we were discussing before, for instance, regarding maintenance scheduling, right? We want the plants to be to go on maintenance at times when the value of the production that we lose is the lowest, okay? But there are not only bad distortions. There's also positive impacts. For instance, I have a paper in which I show, theoretically and with data from the Spanish electricity market, that when you pay renewables at a fixed price, you are mitigating their incentives to exercise market power. Why? Because if the owners of these plants withhold output and this pushes spot market prices up, the renewable output subject to fixed price contract is not going to benefit from the increase in the price. And therefore, the incentives to exercise market power are somehow mitigated, okay? So I think it's extremely relevant and very interesting from a research point of view to understand the pros and the cons of different types of contract designs. But let's not think that they're always bad distortions. Sometimes contract design can help mitigate or offset some of the market failures that we currently have in short-run markets. I hope it was high level enough.
Final question? Yeah. Thomas.
Thank you for the presentation. Maybe I missed this, but does this analysis rely on any assumptions about who the buyers are? For instance, if they're load-serving entities who are passing their prices to customers, what is their incentive to really have lower price long-term contracts? If they're more not load-serving entities, but say industrial customers, are we making assumptions about what their price responsiveness is, or what electricity is worth to them for this analysis to make sense?
Yeah, I think those are relevant questions. If the counterparty is a load-serving entity that can pass on all the contract prices to the final consumers, this would be like the regulated back contracts that we have analyzed, right? Because in that case, there's no risk of default. If the contract price is higher than the spot market price, I cannot care less because I simply pass it on. So when I have one of these counterparties, the risk of contract default is lower. So this would be captured by the degree of counterparty risk in the market. In this simple model, demand for contracts is inelastic. So I'm not allowing for elasticity. To the extent that there is some elasticity, I would have a downward slope in demand, and the results don't change qualitatively. Okay? Clearly, all these elements, which are very important in reality, can be incorporated into the discussions that such a simple model allows to have, because now we know what the ingredients are and what the important channels are. Doesn't mean that I have to look at reality only through the lenses of the model. It means that through the richness of reality, I need to enrich the model to make it relevant and applicable to real-life situations, such as the ones that you mentioned.
Thank you so much, Natalia, for a fantastic talk.
It was my pleasure.